Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar of Jazz as Diplomacy. My name is Neil Gonzalez. I'm the Director for the Center for Jazz and Popular Music at UKZN. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to welcome our panelists, Professor Darius Brubeck, who's the former director at the center, and is streaming live to us today from Connecticut. Which is home for Darius. And we've also got Rafs Mayat, a wonderful photographer. When I first started playing, Rafs was always on the bandstand, or at least in and around it. So you can see his wonderful photography behind him there. And Rafs will be guiding us through more of his work today. And then Mama Namusa is looking resplendently colorful, as she always does. And it's so wonderful to have her on the panel today as well. I'm going to get things started off by just sharing an image, which this is a photograph that actually hangs up here in my office. The struggle for jazz and jazz for the struggle. It's very meaningful to me because it has quite a few musicians in it that I know and have known for a long time, and that have been part of my own journey as a jazz musician. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a photograph of Darius himself, looking very thoughtful there. But most dominant in this photograph is the poster, The Struggle for Jazz and Jazz for the Struggle. So I thought I would ask Darius, by way of introducing him and his presentation today, to quickly give us an idea of what that meant in the 1980s and 1990s in South Africa, because as someone who was a student at that time, that was very much part of campus life. So Darius, if you could please tell us a little bit about this photograph, please. Darius, you are still muted.
That photograph was taken by Comrade Rafs outside of the, no, you're shaking your head, that was taken by Rafs outside of the Rainbow when it changed venues.
Darius, I'm just going to interrupt you. I think the reason Rafs is shaking his head is because the photograph was actually taken by another photographer, Omar Bacha.
Omar, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, both good friends and great supporters of jazz and the jazz scene, and the struggle for jazz is ongoing and worldwide, global. Jazz for the struggle. What that represented in South Africa was a culture that worked beyond race in every way, in terms of audience, in terms of generations, in terms of so-called population groups. And you could see that in the bands, you could see that in the appreciation of jazz, and coming from the other direction, you could see that in terms of the suppression of jazz, in terms of not broadcasting local jazz, and records not being issued, because you don't really need words to get across the central meaning of jazz. It's it's a multicultural fusion. It has American roots, to be sure, and I'm proud of that. But it's a global music, and it comes from everywhere. And everywhere you find jazz, you find people adapting it to their own region, to the music of their own culture, and so it's really broadly humanizing. And I didn't expect to open by answering a question. Maybe this is too long a monologue, but I think we're all on common ground with this. Speaking of common ground, I just want to also, the only person I haven't met live, as it were, is Nomusa. But when I do my reading, it will be revealed that we have something in common. We'll get to that when we do. But just to say that my background in activism really began with civil rights in the US when I was a very young person. And so when I came to South Africa, it was a conscious decision to help with the transformation of institutions, of which the university was one, and is. It's a state institution, and I actually knew that jazz would do that because of the kind of students it would bring in, and just having students on campus like Neil, for example, they don't need external direction. It's just the pursuit of the art, the pursuit of the music, the internalizing what it really means, and then everything struggles on from there. But it's always onward and upward. It's never easy, but things always do get better in the long run.
So Darius, your own journey as a jazz musician brought you to South Africa, but obviously your experience of jazz as diplomacy extends also through your father's own contribution to the music and through the idea of maybe a global ambassadorship. I know that there are many new works, a documentary, books, and so on, all in the works at the moment. Can I ask you to tell us more of the story, please?
Okay. Well, I'd like to read a short section of the book, unless you would prefer us just to have a conversation. I love hanging out with you, but what I have prepared takes us outside of the South African context at first and back to the beginning of my journey as in terms of jazz diplomacy. Just as an aside, this is referring to the formal Jazz Ambassadors program, which is very interesting. And I find it fascinating that I'm often interviewed on this subject by American students and journalists, because it seems like we've lost or at least undervalued something that was very important. As today, when jazz musicians go on the road, whether they're a part of an official program or not, we represent American culture. And we knew at the time, back in the day, that we were being used for propaganda purposes, but we actually, my father certainly actually sincerely believed that democracy was better than Stalinist totalitarianism. And the great advantage for people like Charles Mingus, Duke, Louis Armstrong, who refused to go at first and then eventually did. And my father was that by being made official, that gave them status, a platform to reflect back to the United States, the disagreements they had with Jim Crow laws and things like that. And they couldn't be considered just marginal malcontents. They were doing important ambassadorial work. And you could say that there's a wider diplomatic community that, basically it is about establishing connections between people. yes, it's to carry out foreign policy, whatever it might be. Those are the official goals. But it always does more than that. And if I can move on to my reading, this will take us out of South Africa and then back. This is called Prelude. And this is Poland, 2018. Moving carefully in the dazzling light, I stepped off the stage at Radio Szczecin Concert Hall to embrace a beaming, well-dressed elderly woman who stood up from her seat next to Kathy at a front row table. She had been to the first concert of the Dave Brubeck Quartet's 1958 tour. Speaking through an interpreter, she told me that she went backstage with a group of fans to see my father and tried to get as close to him as possible, but that sadly, when she saw what a beautiful woman my mother was, she knew she didn't stand a chance. Turning to Kathy, she said that she didn't remember a lot about the music except the two little boys. My brother Michael was one and the other was me. We had been pushed on stage by the Polish tour manager who wanted to demonstrate that the great Dave Brubeck from America was not afraid to bring his family to communist Poland. Even at age 10, I knew that once in front of an audience, one was supposed to do something, so I went to my father at the piano and Joe Morello stood up and beckoned Mike to the drums. We played Take the A Train, well known in Eastern Bloc countries as the theme music from Willis Conover's Voice of America shortwave radio broadcasts. So my first public performance took place in Szczecin, and here I was again, 60 years later, beginning a concert tour with my own quartet. Earlier in 2018, I was invited to play Take 5 with the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra in Szczecin, which was an honor. But what made this trip remarkable was a VIP tour of the Solidarity Museum. Can we have that image, Neil? Most of the museum is literally underground in Solidarity Square. This is certainly jazz for the struggle. It is now a memorial park on the site where pro-democracy demonstrators were shot by Polish and Soviet police. Now I want the, yeah, there we are. In December 1970, its gray, undecorated cement exterior and hunched low-profile shape reminded us of the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. It is a narrative museum like the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, where you walk the walk in semi-darkness to the soundtrack of historic news reports and environmental sounds. Here in Poland, the subterranean journey begins in post-war occupied Poland and ends with full sovereignty in 1989. The first vitrine contained only two objects, a short wave radio circa those days. The Voice of America began broadcasting in 1956, and the cover of a Dave Brubeck concert program. These iconic objects spoke for those times. 60 years later, after Dave Brubeck's 1958 US State Department tour, we understood the special attention we, meaning my group, were now getting and the importance of jazz in this historical timeline. The Poles themselves attributed even greater impact to the Dave Brubeck Quartet's cultural exchange tour, to use the Cold War term, than its most ardent proponents in the USIS, United States Information Service, dared claim. As in South Africa, jazz engaged people on levels beyond fandom. This doesn't mean that all Polish jazz fans were political activists, but they were longing for a more open society. The museum walk included video clips of speeches and Soviet propaganda, anti-Soviet demonstrations, strikes, and rallies, newsreels featuring scenes of uprisings and state violence, the Solidarity negotiations, and 4 foreign heads of state who helped free Poland: Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Pope John Paul. Names not remembered by us as champions of freedom and human rights, but given the history of solidarity, they obviously deserve some credit. For the current tour of Poland with the Darius Brubeck Quartet, we were followed by a film crew from the moment we arrived in Szczecin, giving us an aura of modern-day celebrity. A documentary was a chance for the filmmaker to explore how jazz is still linked to histories of social change. Kathy and I had engaged with cultural diplomacy throughout my career in South Africa, but we were still diplomats. But if we were still diplomats, what country do we represent? Does retracing my father's 1958 tour in then communist Poland and introducing university jazz education in South Africa during apartheid really form a connected narrative? Jazz music is universally associated with ideals of freedom and struggle against oppression. The rationales and modalities of oppression and expressions of freedom are specific and extremely different depending on local circumstances. The music itself is global. Jazz musicians from everywhere go everywhere. Jazz festivals are tourist attractions on every continent. The UN celebrates International Jazz Day every year. Proclaiming jazz is the music of freedom sounds like just another marketing cliche these days, but despite that, it is still true. The intriguing thing is how the jazz struggle trope manifests in radically different societies, where it is clear that this music matters. Its association with freedom is concretely historic and specific for the people who live in these countries. Fortuitously, for the film project, my journey as a musician started in Poland as a 10-year-old and arguably culminates in South Africa. The performance of jazz in South Africa under apartheid, or in Poland under Stalinist Russia, was often a consciously political gesture, that is, playing the changes that people yearned for. So how are we doing for time? I suppose that was about it, right?
We are doing fine for time. Thanks, Darius. It must have been a very powerful experience to find yourself back on that stage, like you say, 60 years later. The sense of things coming full circle.
Yes. Well, it was more the museum that got to me emotionally. I literally had tears in my eyes when I saw it, because you know, the history of using jazz as a diplomatic tool that has been successful over such a long period of time, and to see that it had the impact that it did from the point of the recipients, as it were, you know, that just blew my mind. I wasn't expecting that at all. And quite a few of the people who came to our concerts, we duplicated most of the stops on my father's 1958 tour, were grandchildren or even great grandchildren, and, you know, bringing some obviously very old people in. And it was kind of like a victory lap, you know. It would be like in South Africa, if you had musicians who were, you know, out there doing big festivals in 1994, getting together and doing it again at some point. You know, it was very symbolic. It was kind of like, okay, here we all are, and sure, neither society has reached its goals in terms of what was expected or wanted, but there was this liberation moment that was, you know, a shared experience, and jazz was apparently.
Okay, I think we've lost just the feed for now. Darius is frozen. It might be Darius, it might be an idea for you to switch your video off at this point. But if we have lost Darius, then maybe
Just
this is.
did.
Ah, there you go. I think you're back.
Yeah, I'm here. I've cut my video
Okay.
feed.
Right. It was great while it lasted, by the way.
Okay. So many
so-
things in life are like that, aren't they?
Yeah. I think instead of getting to any questions and answers for now, I think I'll save that for the end of the session. And I thought that I'd move on now to Mama Namusa, and then we'll come back to you, Darius. So Mama Namusa is a storyteller, an author. She grew up in Chicago, and as a civil rights activist, and our connection with Mama Namusa is also through her husband, and now sadly late, Baba Ndiko Kaba, who was in exile for many years. So Mama Namusa has a very wide experience of jazz as diplomacy, and as someone who has been on the forefront of fighting for human rights in many parts of the world. So Mama Namusa, it's a great pleasure to have you on the panel. And can you please share some of your story with us?
Oh, there we go. I'm unmuted. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. And I just want to say Darius's story is, you know, it just takes your breath away. And I definitely have to get the book, you know, so I can get, even though Darius and I are from the same country, you know, we come from different worlds, of course. And I've never had the opportunity to interact with him. So this is a real treat. Playing the changes for which people longed for. Oh, that's magnificent. Thank you for that. Anyway, I want to start by saying diplomacy presupposes a conflict, right? Presupposes a conflict for which diplomacy is necessary. And I want to talk a little bit about that by way of a really quick story. So I want you, if you will, to pretend that you're a farmer in Mississippi in the USA in about 1910. And you're away from your farm for you know, short period, and your neighbor, whom you've known forever, comes over to your farm and takes one of your chickens. And you come home and your family tells you the story. You're like, what up with this guy? So you go over to his farm and you know, you're a bit irate, said, what's going on? Yeah, I'm taking my chicken back. However, you are Black and he is white. And the rule in Mississippi is Black people have no rights for which white people must respect. So heated conversation quickly goes into him rallying all of his white neighbors. They call them the good old boys, the vigilantes, those who are always ready for a fight. And they tie you to the back of a truck and they drag you into town. And they're about to kill you. They're about to hang you on a tree, which in the US is called lynching. It was very common, happened thousands of times. during this intensity, your dear sister gets word of what's going on, and she immediately goes to a white man in that area who is a prominent intercede, to be the diplomat, to intercede and to stop this. And he does so. He does so. Very, very rare, but it happened. And this is a true story. The woman involved is my great-grandmother, Mrs. Louise Parker, was her brother, Saul Street, who was the intended victim, the man who stood up for him. We don't know his name. There's only one caveat. Your life is spared now, but you must leave town immediately, like before the sun sets, which means you must leave your wife, your children, all of your family, your land, everything to save your life. And so he does. And the other caveat is everyone who is closely associated with you, your wife, your children, your sister, your cousins, must also leave quickly. And that is the true story of how my family came to Chicago. Not only is it my story, but it's the story of thousands of people. And we were part of what is commonly known as the Great Migration, or the movement of people of African descent who were in bondage in the US for many hundreds of years, to the northern cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and New York. And that is the general narrative. So I want to say the music is rooted in humanity and people not having an expression. You will know, we know Chicago now is a great music center. It has horrible climate, but it is a great music center. And some of your early blues and jazz labels rooted there. Gospel music was created by Thomas Dorsey in Chicago. That's documentable. So it's a tremendous musical center. My parents were both musicians. My mother played piano and organ. My father played trumpet. And later on, he lived to be 98. Later on, he played guitar. And my father firmly believed that all the world's problems could be solved with music, that jazz was the answer to everything, that children should be taught music from the time they were born. So he was my first dance partner. And every Friday night was culture night. And my brother and I would have to listen to the music of Count Basie and Duke Ellington. We were told these were people who are relatives. I still think of them as my uncles. And Ella Fitzgerald and Joe Williams and whoever was popular at the time. But my father, born in the 20s, grew up in the 30s. And he was very clear that he wanted us to also grow up in the 30s. And so he would recreate as best he could the Savoy Ballroom and all of these Club de Lisa, all of these wonderful places that I feel like I went to. Diminuendo in Blue and Crescendo in Blue, we danced to every Friday night. He was my first dance partner. And as I got older, we would actually dance together at weddings and whatever. And I'm like 8 years old and he's 6 feet tall. So we were quite a team. You know, we created quite an interest. Fast forward 1970, as Neil mentioned, I actually married a musician from South Africa, Ndiko Xaba in San Francisco. And he was part of a play by Alan Payton, the first African play to appear on Broadway, which had 22 cast members. Very significant, 1964. Very significant that out of a cast of 22, 11 came back to South Africa after the successful run, that Broadway run, and 11 stayed. And I believe Caiphus Semenya is the last living member of that cast. We could check that, but I've been keeping in touch. Notable and not as well known is Sikulu Shange, I'm sorry, who owned what they called African Records. He was a great diplomat, keeping African music and all kinds of music alive next door to the Apollo. He was there for 30 or 40 years. It was the African Center in Harlem. So South Africa has a strong presence in Harlem. It really, really does. So I don't know. I could go, I'm a storyteller, Neil, so I could go on forever. I don't know how much you want me to do. I can talk about Ndiko and I, the Baba duo, we performed together. I did percussion and poetry, and Baba played piano, and he made a lot of instruments, traditional instruments, non-traditional instruments. He also, like my father, believed music to be the strongest force in the world. And he was what we called ourselves cultural workers. He was a struggle stalwart, both of us, but he was strongly vocal way before anybody, really. Vocal in his support of the ANC. Most people didn't want to give an affiliation. It was, in those days, outside the country was only the PAC or the ANC. Inside you had UDF and all kinds of things, but outside, to my knowledge, you only had those two organizations. And most people didn't want to identify because they weren't sure who would eventually be in power. They, whatever. They had their own reasons. But Ndiko was always strongly vocal about his affiliation until the day he died, really. Anybody who knows him knows that. So we performed together. We produced a few CDs, and my email, mamanomusa@gmail, if you're interested in any of the CDs or my book. I wrote a memoir in which the story of Uncle Saul, which you were the character in, I put that story. That story took me 50 years to get the truth. No one would say it. All they would say is Uncle Saul, white man, chicken. And I said, wait, come on. That's how we got to Chicago. And you'd say, what? And people would hush you up. And only when I wrote the book did I get an elder aunt to actually lay it down for me. I was actually able to interview his daughter to tell me about those times. So that's all I got to say, Neil.
Thank you so much, Mama Musa. I must say that, I had the wonderful privilege of performing both with you and with Baba Ndiko Kawa and our friend, Professor Salim Washington, here at the center. And that experience was very powerful because it reminded me of actually when I was a student in the 80s and 90s, when, I used to be in bands with guys like Feya Faku and Lex Fuchani, Mfana Mlombo. And when we got on stage, before we would get on stage, we would all kind of get in a circle and kind of have this feeling that we were now going to do something that was very special and very powerful. We knew that the music was going to do something. So we were aware of the power of the music. And when all those years later, when I got to play with you guys at the center, this came back to me in a very strong way. The notion of music as vibration and as energy. And it seemed that Ndiko was very in tune with that. Each song had a very specific intention. There were such specific themes, whether they were themes to do with social justice, or whether they had to do with the ecology, creating social awareness. But every song, like I say, had a very specific intention. And that is such a powerful thing. I think it's also powerful because it's not something that we focus very much on when we teach the music. I'm saying at institutional level. Often, our focus is really on the information. But when you are working with a musician like this, or with musicians that come from the community where the music is meaningful and powerful, where it means something more than just the notes on the page or even the sound of the music on a record, then you kind of understand that there's another dimension to all of the stuff that you're doing. So I want to just say thank you so much for that experience and for sharing your story with us today. We'll have more of this conversation at the end, but now I want to move on to Rafs, who tells his stories most often through his beautiful photography. But Rafs is also a journalist, and like I say, has been around for longer than I have on jazz stages, so he has many stories to share. Over to you, Rafs.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Yeah, I started photography in mid-1983, and I've always been on the periphery of the music sort of scene, and having worked running a jazz club, Tippies in Joburg. I worked in a radio station, Capital Radio, when it first started. And I worked at the Cape Town International Jazz Festival for 15 years, curating and coordinating the production side of the gallery there, the Geotone Gallery. But my photography was part of our activism at the time in the 80s. And so I was part of a collective called Afropix, a photographic collective. I think it was probably the only one that was around at the time. And we'd be running around the townships covering events, rallies, meetings, Curry's Fountain, and various places that the mainstream media of the time weren't covering at all. So I'd been collecting records, discs, LPs, albums from 1969. And I built up a small collection, but it was, like I say, there was always music in the house. There was always poets around, musicians occasionally. My uncle was a great jazz guitarist. And through my photography and running around the townships, I'd find, it was the old days of black and white film, you'd go and process. But you'd go to the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, you ended up a gig somewhere to this venue in Pinetown called the Rainbow Restaurant and Jazz Club, which is that first picture that Neil showed of Omar's picture showing the march from the old rainbow to the new rainbow. I'd often end up there after a meeting, after maybe being tear gassed and chased around somewhere. And I'd take a few friends because that was my refuge at the time, music. And I built up quite a fairly large collection, not only from the Rainbow, but from other gigs. I've been countless, there's thousands of them I've been to, and I really have a big selection of collection archive, which is not organized, but it's all there. So I've been to several gigs, but one of the ones that sticks in my mind was in 1990 when Abdullah Ibrahim came back after exile. He came back and he performed at the Wits Grace Hall in Johannesburg. It was brought out by the Weekly Mail, and which was a newspaper, the predecessor of the Mail and Guardian. And he came back, and everyone was at the airport, and it's all the media's there, the film people, the Stoles people, all different folks. And someone broke ranks, and it was just media bun fights, a gangbang, and everyone just charging, trying to get. But Abdullah had come back and he had set the bar for many musicians because he wanted to be treated in the same way he had been treated in other parts of the world. So he had, before we could actually get accreditation to the gig at the Wits Grace Hall, he had all these clauses in his contracts. No flashes, no motor drives. He wanted fruit and veg in his change room, stuff like that there, flowers. There was all these different things that I found out about later on. And so at the gig at the Wits Grace Hall, all the photographers was crushed together at the bottom end near the piano stool on the stage, and all sitting there waiting for this guy to come and start. And so he walks on stage and he plays a bit, and everyone's taking pictures. Clack, 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 clack. All he hears is shutters going up. Clack, 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 clack. And he leans over and he says, "Can you guys keep it down there, please? I'm trying to make some music here." So that took care of 95% of us. We had to just sit back now. And for me, I didn't mind. I was there to absorb the music as well. So only people with silent shutters, like people that owned Leicas, could actually get pictures. And so I didn't really I got a few pictures at the end of the concert. Hugh Masekela walked in somewhere as well. And Abdullah saw him in the audience at the end of the gig and brought him on stage and raised his hand like a boxer, and trying to get pictures now at the end because it's madness. And Rashid Lombard, also a photographer and later on the director of the Jazz Festival, was working with another guy, Rapizzi. They were doing a documentary about Abdullah's return to South Africa. So he said, don't worry, if you're going to be in Durban next week, we'll do something at the sound check. And he arranged with Abdullah's manager at the time, Abdel Nerat, who lives now in Vancouver. And so I came to Durban. I'm from Durban. I was in Joburg for a while. And I went to the sound check, but I went very early. I was there like about 2 hours before he came. And he walked in and checks out the action on the piano and he's trying it out there. And so I asked him just before he started, I said, in my best broken Afrikaans, kan ek kanala paar kikkies vat asseblief? And meaning, can I take a few pictures, please? Because he's got a reputation of photographers. He doesn't like us a lot. Anyway, he said, okay, Marco, hurry up, do it quickly. So I was able to get a few pictures. And this is the picture behind me. I'll show you on the share screen now. I'll show you the picture. One of 3 friends that I got taken through the piano. And it was, he went on to do workshops up here at Howard College and stuff like that. And I've got pictures of Darius and Kathy in the change room after the gig from that very evening. So for me, it was important that we have these heroes that sometimes the music was banned. Yuma Sikela, Dollar, Miriam, some of the music was banned. It was circulated in different ways at the time, like books, and we had censorship and all this kind of stuff. So for me, it was important to get this picture, and it's been a favorite of mine for a long time. It's got a little window on the side. It's taken at the Durban City Hall on the side of the stage. And the funny thing was once someone showed him the picture and he said, yeah, I remember that was taken in the cathedral in Cologne. Oh, no, it wasn't. It was done in Durban. So yeah, that was the thing for me. I mean, jazz musicians have always been at the forefront of struggles around the world, I think. There's the famous sort of albums of the drummer Max Roach and other people like Charles Mingus and what have you. So there's always been a connection between the two for me as well, Like I say, some of the music wasn't available, it was banned, but people made a plan and they got it out and it was circulated like books that were banned in the past and all the kind of stuff that people had to endure at the time. And for me, I just felt it's important that I document musicians. So Through the Rainbow, it's turning 41 this year, I think. And the music's been going since 1983. But I've been fortunate enough to, in some form or the other, through my pictures, to record a lot of what happened at the time. Not just the running around the townships, but the musicians and the music as well. It was often played there at the Rainbow, which was an incredible venue at the time. So I've been lucky in that sense to get these pictures, and I don't know what I'm going to do with them. I have this huge archive, which is it's there. I've got it all, but it's not very organized. But I also had another nasty little habit of jumping on the stage after the gig and taking the set list off the floor. Usually it was written in the musician's own handwriting, so quite a few of those. It's another form of documentation, or tickets, or posters, or flyers, or stuff like that there. So essentially that's where I was coming from back in the day. I can show a few pics if you like, share screen, just a handful of them, if it's okay with you guys. So I'll just, give you a quick rundown of some of my stuff.
Yes, thanks, Raps.
Okay. Let's see. Share, okay. This is the picture I've been referring to behind me. I have several others of different South African musicians, mostly incredible Busi Mhlongo. Mankunku and Bani Ratchabani, Mambusi again. He has a black and white. One of Darius, another one of Darius, Louis Moholo, one of the younger guys now, Mandla Langeni, Sidney Mavundla, who was also a student here at university. This guy's been around for a long time in Durban. Cherry Knene, Kesavan Naidu, living in Switzerland now. This is a gig of Bogani Daya and some young music lovers. The great Lee Konitz, our own McCoy Mjubata. That's McCoy again with another fancy one. This is Melvin Peters and Mike Rossi. And then the pioneers, the jazz pioneers, Robbie Jansen. Robbie Jansen again was really my favorite entertainer, South African entertainer. And this was in Holland, Sean Bergen, the great Sipho Gumede, young Sisonti Twenty, the great Mankunku. So I have several of these pictures, and this is like a really small selection. But I also do have, I must just try and find it though, is, I think, no, it's not this one here. I have a few from the gig that you spoke about, Mama Musa. Let's see, I can't seem to open it now. But yeah, essentially, resume share, okay. Doesn't, yeah, that's Baba Kaba. And that was at the Bat Center. And this one was, yeah, I don't know if you can see these, at that gig of Baba Ndiko and Mama Musa. And I have, like I say, I've got quite a few of these. So I'll stop sharing now and go back to you, Neil, because I'm pretty much done with my little bit.
Thanks very much, Rafs.
Okay.
It's beautiful to hear the story, well, your story, the story of Abdullah, but also just so wonderful to see a story through picture. I am listening to all of your stories, and I'm thinking on the idea of migration. I think Mama Musa mentioned the Great Migration, and obviously Darius's father went to Poland and took jazz to Poland, and probably with no idea that 60 years later, his son would arrive there and observe for himself the impact of that tour. I think on Darius's own work, I mean, we had a concert at the Jazz Center last night, and looking at some of those photos of Rafs taken at the Jazz Center, for example, and wonder if when Darius started up the Jazz Center all those years ago in 1989, whether he fully understood the impact of the space on so many people, so many musicians. So the idea of migration through time, the sense that we get of like, we don't always understand things, the power of things in the time and in the moment, but we gain perspective through the passage of time, which is a kind of migration as well. And the thing about photographs is that they capture a moment in time. I was looking at a photograph on Facebook that Rafs had taken of the great Sandile Shange at the Rainbow, where Rafs was, I think he put a comment on the photo and explained that Sandile didn't have his instrument with him, so was using someone else's guitar and was just checking the tuning. And so when I think about the challenges that we face these days around the freedom of movement, in terms of problems around immigrants, migrants, migrant workers, and all of these things. These are not necessarily new problems, but one would have thought that we would have found better solutions. And also, like Mama Musa said, for diplomacy to exist, there has to be conflict in the first place. But it seems like one of the things that causes a lot of conflict is the movement of people. Well, the movement of people creates conflict, but it also brings lots of solutions and lots of color and lots of variety. And it kind of seems to add to the spice of life. Darius described jazz as this kind of starting in the United States, but this multi-ethnic thing that takes roots in so many different parts of the world, a global music, but each community kind of fashions its own take on things. So I've kind of brought all of these kind of threads into this little kind of monologue, but I'd like to hear your own kind of thoughts about that, and then also invite you to ask any questions that you'd like in terms of the presentations that you've heard from each other.
Could I just, yeah, I hear what you say about bringing all the threads together and in terms of migration and stuff, but there's, like you say, every place where jazz is played has been influenced by the circumstances of the place. And South Africa is no different. We do have a unique voice because of the other genres of music that are played here, Mbatanga, Maskandi music. All that feeds into our sounds. And I think it's great that we have those influences as well. We do have a very young, not very young, but an exciting crop of musicians. The younger people like Sisonke Konti, Bongani Daya, that are really doing amazing stuff, you know, and it's a far more open kind of, not really experimental sound, but they aren't restricted by record companies. And that's what I think is great about it. So there's always some new stuff coming out. And if you follow Sis Gwen Ansell's blog, there's always brilliant stuff. And she's reviewed some of the stuff, and she informs so much. And that's where I learn a lot of stuff from, listening to her. Yeah, I think that's my little bit there about our influences. Okay.
Yes, can I speak? I don't know if I'm supposed to raise my hand, but anyway, I'm talking now. Yes, Rafs, I absolutely agree. And Africa is the root. Africa is absolutely the root. And the African, and this is very generally spoken, but the African cultural understanding, the African way, and this is very general again, is to share, is to give. It is not to separate and put in a little box and this is exclusively only for these people with this much money or who live on the hill or whatever. It is this whole thing of Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Abantu, Ubuntu. We're all in this, and Africa is absolutely the root. And jazz is one, you know, or whatever they call jazz, you know, what people call jazz, is one part of it. And South Africans are part of, you can't separate, you know, and the sound, the beauty of Rafs and the others was that while Miriam, Mama Miriam and Bra Hugh and Babandiko and Caiaphas and all of them were banned in the US, they were alive were banned in South Africa, they were alive in the US. So as a teenager, Mama Miriam was my first example of a proud African woman born on African soil. We had been told all kinds of lies about where we came from and who we were and who we weren't, you know. And I was absolutely amazed to see her on television the first time on the Steve Allen show in 1960, whatever, while she was banned. She was my biggest role model. You know what I'm saying? It's a personal contact. Bra Hugh, grazing in the grass, everything he did, I was and still am. I don't care what he does. A fan of Hugh Masekela, right? Read his book 100 times, whatever. But and you know, Hugh is very colorful, but it doesn't matter. I am a fan. What he brought to us as young people. So Africa is the root. Africa is the root, and because of that nature, we share it with the entire world. Very unlike, no disrespect or criticism, other cultures, which make some of this stuff exclusive to certain classes. You know what I'm saying?
Can I just, yeah, oh, it's Darius? Okay. Just that music is an international language and is spoken all over. And in fact, one of our finest trumpeters, Marcus Wyatt, has an album out called Language 12, because we have 11 official languages in our country. And music is language 12 for us, but not just here, it's all over the world. It's internationally spoken. Jazz is spoken here, as some say. And though some people have been asking that question, is jazz dead? And there's cynical answers like, no, it just smells funny. It's strong, it's still going strong. And it's what we love, and it's gonna be around for quite a while longer, I think. That's my little bit there.
Thanks, Refs. Darius, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Is
Unmute
Darius still
Darius.
with us? Was unmute? I wonder if Darius is still here. Well,
I'm still here.
okay. I was just asking.
This
whether
has
there
been
was-
too interesting. Even if you couldn't hear or see me, I wouldn't leave the room because I'm so enjoying and I'm only hesitating because I think it's all been said. Some of it was said by me earlier, and Mama Namusa and Raf Smayat have contributed eloquently to the theme of the universality and bonding and so forth. My notes in preparing for this focused more narrowly on the premise of jazz diplomacy, which has the amazing history that I already talked about. So I'm kind of the themes that have been discussed by everybody. All I can say is, I would just be adding other words to what is saying about the universality and so forth. Perhaps my perspective then, to add something different, though less important, is that I'm quite unusually familiar with the official world and how that interacts. And again, it's part of just my family history. And I think an important point to make is that every human being is potentially an ambassador. And when you go out, you don't go out to represent your country exactly, but you're taken that way. And here's the thing: the more, I used to think, well, during the early Bush years, I was still in South Africa, right? And I used to be a bit embarrassed about being an American, and then I realized, no, I should play it up. I shouldn't soften my accent. I shouldn't dress differently or anything. I'm showing that there are different kinds of Americans. There's the kind I am. And, I was long gone by the Trump years. And I want to say something rather sad about that, but I'm actually so glad that my parents passed away during the Obama years. They had to go sometime. They were in their 90s. So they didn't live to see the terrible backsliding and culture wars and racism of America now. We all went to dinner and sat at a table in the State Department. We all went to hosted by Hillary Clinton. We sat with Bill and talked about saxophones while Obama, as president, gave a welcoming speech. So, you know, life goes in these long cycles. So, you know, they lived to see a great culmination while they were still healthy and happy and able to enjoy it. And among people in officialdom who were, you know, culturally mature enough to, let's see, who else was at that table? Well, I don't know. I won't go into it because it'll just sound like a lot of name dropping. But you know, like there was there. You know, it was to name one. And the interesting thing is that it kind of transcended politics. My parents didn't have a specific political profile. Is as soon as my father started getting famous, he hardly ever told my mother what to do, but he did strictly say, don't join any party, because as soon as you do, then whatever you say will be taken as speaking for someone else, right? You know, you adhere to principles, and people from whatever side will, you know, will find their way to understand it. So, you know, don't join a party. And they became somewhat friendly with Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And my brother Chris and my parents went to Moscow ambassadorial year. That was the year of the Jazanians being first International Association for Jazz Education Conference, Detroit. And that required a lot of, you know, very, very careful political negotiation. And we had help from Mama Namusa will recognize this name, Representative John Conyers. You remember him? Okay, Black Caucus in US Congress, and ANC in exile to make that possible. So I moved from Moscow to Detroit to South Africa quite deliberately. There are these bonds that get created outside of politics that are nevertheless in the political world. When my father and brother went to Moscow with the Reagans, also in 1988, it was in the context of being the entertainment while the Soviet Union and the US negotiated the SALT Treaty. That's an acronym, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which held up until the Trump administration. Now, what did this have to do with Dave Brubeck? Well, Gorbachev, I guess through Voice of America or maybe his staff listening to it illegally or something, happened to know that that was the name of an American musician he knew. So Nancy Reagan kind of figured that out. So we hear that it would be a good idea just to have them along to entertain at Spaza House, which is the huge American embassy in Moscow. And according to the staff, as soon as the Gorbachev people, you know, kind of relaxed with the music, then the negotiations took a completely different turn. They began to see each other as human beings. With the Jazanians in the US, we had to tread a very careful line, because it's 1988, that we were showing the best of what South Africa could be, and at the same time, make it clear that we weren't trying to make it seem like everything was okay. But by then, Brahu and Miriam and Abdullah had already done a very good job of showing that music and musicians were the potential of that society, that there was a political problem. This hasn't been very orderly, but I'll just close by saying that the reason there was so much of that kind of diplomatic and cultural interaction in the 80s and 90s is that Western governments, and I think very proactively in South Africa, British, Swiss, German, all of the Scandinavian nations, particularly Norway, France a little less because they were more concerned with Francophone Africa, were finding ways to interact with South African society that didn't involve the South African government. So culture was an important way of interacting without interacting directly with the government or interacting directly with political parties, and establishing friendly relations, and not to overlook the self-motivation, establishing influence. So jazz has been a very, I think, positive and powerful tool as far as implementing direct relationships between people in different societies. And they don't necessarily have to be named as ambassadors by governments, but it's worked so well in a way it's kind of more neutral, you might say, because now, well, I remember at the Jazz Center, we've hosted musicians from quite a few countries. And now I think it's more than ever, it's really about the music, and it's not an effective tool of American imperialism, if you will, simply because you could also be hosting musicians from Portugal, you know, and it works just as well. I'm sorry if it wasn't quite the coherent shaping and wrapping up Sabia was calling for, but I think I have brought it back to the diplomacy theme.
Yes, thanks very much for that, Darius. And I think one of the most powerful things you said was right at the beginning there, where you said that, you know, we all have the potential to be ambassadors, even if unintended. I must say, you know, sometimes when you see all of the negative stuff that seems to be going around, the cycle of so much stuff that you don't really want the world to be, it's difficult to lose sight and lose belief, or it's difficult to keep believing. But I think one understands that actually everything that we do, whatever positive change we can make in our own little way, that serves some purpose in terms of being diplomats for what we believe in, then it's the thing to do. You know, whenever it's someone's birthday, especially jazz musicians, on Facebook, one of the things I often write is I say, keep swinging.
Yeah.
And when I say keep swinging, I don't necessarily mean, I'm not really talking about the right symbol. I think I'm talking more about a baseball bat, in as much as you just got to keep putting your best foot forward. You just got to take your shot and do it every day. And I must say that this conversation has made me feel much lighter and brighter and feeling much more optimistic. So I'd like to say, to bring things to a close, to say thank you so much to you, Darius, to you, Refs, and to you, Mama Namusa, for your wonderful contribution, not just to our conversation today, but in terms of you swinging in your way through your lives and really improving life for all of us. I want to say to our audience as well, thank you so much for tuning in. This is part of our Jazz Effect, Jazz Appreciation Month, leading up to International Jazz Day. We've got another webinar at 3 p.m. tomorrow about jazz education resources. There's lots of exciting stuff happening, especially on the South African front, with the introduction of the South African Rio book. There's Billy Monama's introduction to South African jazz styles or South African guitar styles. We're also going to be talking to someone, Pete Rosser, from the Associated Board for the Royal Schools of Music, about their graded syllabus. So all of these things are jazz education resources. So if you are a teacher or a student, anyone that's interested in jazz, playing the music, understanding the music, then that's definitely something to tune into as well. And then another jazz webinar on Saturday, also at 3 p.m. with much more of an industry focus. This in tandem with our concerts. There's a concert at the Jazz Center tonight. Actually, one of the reasons I've got to wrap up this webinar is because Rafs is sitting in the Jazz Center and we've got to get started with our sound check. So yeah, there's lots of great music to look forward to. We've got a schools concert happening here tomorrow night, and then an Afro jazz guitar concert happening on Saturday. So keep your eyes on our social media page, the Center for Creative Arts page, the Center for Jazz and Popular Music page, the South African Association for Jazz Education page, Sagia Music Productions, and the University of Johannesburg Arts page. Those are our partners. And I'd like to say thank you so much to all of them. And we're looking forward to a really interesting and swinging jazz week. Thank you very much. And thanks for attending. Goodbye.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Rafs.
It's all about timing. These musicians are waiting to come in here. I got to get out.